Today, what I'm going to do is give you a bit of an introduction to the course itself, to some of the themes of what we're covering here as well over the next few weeks. And I'll say a little bit more about myself down the track as well, just so you've got an idea of where I'm coming from, not just physically, geographically, but what my research is as well, just to give you a bit of I guess, a bit of context to what I'm saying here as well. But really, I guess, for a course that deals with the transformations of journalism in the social media age, the differences that we now see that have emerged really over the past, well, almost 20 years now, but the ongoing transformation that's taking place there. I want to start with this question: what actually is so different about journalism today? What has changed? What are sort of the key drivers of that change as well? And ideally without falling into the trap of technological determinism, so without just blaming everything on technology, which certainly has a role to play, but technology is only ever as good as the people who are using it. So it's ultimately how we're using the available technologies, of course, that's changing how journalism works and how anything else works as well. So yeah, I'll start, I guess, by this image. Does anyone know who these people are? Any idea? No? That's okay. This is probably how, I guess, people of my generation might think of what journalists look like and how they work. And even people of the generation before me, more so, might think of this as, this is journalists. This is what a newsroom looks like as well, what journalism in itself looks like. These are Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the two people who broke the Watergate scandal back in the 1960s that ultimately, I was almost going to say Donald Trump, but Richard Nixon stumbled over. And in the middle there is the publisher of the Washington Post that broke that scandal, Catherine Graham. So this is the core team in some ways of one of the biggest, up until recently, one of the biggest scandals in US politics that literally claimed the job of a president. And this is what the people looked like. They're young guys, actually, comparatively, in their wonderful kind of 60s, 70s get-up and hairstyles and everything. In a newsroom where you certainly won't see any computers yet, because really they hadn't quite been invented, I suppose. But you see maybe a few typewriters in the background, and you see lots of paper and filing cabinets and all this sort of stuff sitting around. So in some ways, this is the kind of journalism of what some people call high modernity, of sort of the height of the 20th century in some sense. This is what journalism used to look like. People standing around in fluorescently lit offices discussing the news and how they're going to cover it, with the watchful eye of their publisher or their editor over them, saying, well, okay, yes, but be careful because someone might end up suing us, or we need to uphold the reputation of the paper, of the publisher as well. So that's kind of the classic thing. And if you've ever watched any kind of old 70s movies where there's journalists in there, or even more recent movies that are set in that time frame, this is sort of the depiction of journalists. You can kind of almost imagine that somewhere in the background there, draped over a seat, there's kind of a leather jacket or something that they'll wear when they go out, and it's that sort of time. So that's what journalism kind of used to look like, but really the top echelon of journalism used to look like back at that time. Now, that's not really the picture of journalism anymore today, obviously. So this time has well and truly passed. Today you'd see maybe something that looks more like this. Maybe not so much that the person is on Facebook, but even that might be relevant in some way, but it's that kind of setup. So you've got, a computer, you've got a phone, you might have a tablet, you might have a bunch of other devices, maybe a handheld recording device, although the phone, of course, can do that as well. And maybe they're sitting in a Starbucks somewhere or some other kind of co-working space, or just on, somewhere on a park bench typing up their story, whatever it might be. So that's one of the really the big changes, obviously, that's happened. That particularly with the arrival of laptop computers and more recently tablets and smartphones and so on, journalism has become a lot more mobile. You're not lugging your typewriter along, but you have this multifunctional communication device that you're carrying along. You're kind of working from anywhere and nowhere. Yes, there are still newsrooms, and there are still those neon-lit offices where people get together and plan perhaps the coverage of the day, or allocate tasks to different reporters and so on. But a lot of this happens then much more individually distributed in this sort of, from anywhere at any time kind of mode, and possibly a little bit more individualistically as well. This is just one, this is obviously a stock image, but this is just one person doing this, could be doing this from anywhere, really. Could be sitting on a train typing their story. So you may not have these sort of large newsrooms with large teams kind of coming together and doing all the story planning and the layout on the newspaper. Sorry, let me just interrupt. Does anyone here still read newspapers? Like actual physical papers? Okay, there's maybe 5, 6 or so of you. Great, and this is not, I'm not trying to make you out as an aberration, but it is becoming quite unusual to do that. Most people, and you are not normal generally because you are students. Sorry, that came out wrong, but you are not normal because you are, media, communication, journalism students perhaps as well. So you are by default more interested in the news, in the media, in communication. Many ordinary people, whatever that means these days, are not going to be buying the newspaper. Or if they're buying it, then perhaps, or if they're getting it, then perhaps it's some free city newspaper, or maybe they're buying it for the sports coverage or the weather or whatever, But lots of people no longer read newspapers, obviously. So just planning out what's the page of the newspaper going to look like, who cares? You're going to see some story online that circulates somewhere. So the rest of the paper doesn't really interest you, perhaps. So this is maybe what journalism today might look like. Another picture might be something like that. That's, again, a stock photo, obviously, and overly dramatic. But if you look at this, and you're seeing a guy, and that's probably still, frankly, there's a gender imbalance still going on in journalism today in many countries. I don't actually know whether that's so true for Switzerland, but it's certainly true in many other countries. And if you look at his kit there as well, if you actually look closely, somewhere in the middle there, that's simply an iPhone or a smartphone of some form. You see that there? In the middle, that kind of gray bit with an extra lens sort of attached and this sort of weird plastic thing attached around it, and obviously a better microphone and some lighting attached and everything else, and probably something to hold it steady and so on. But ultimately, that's just a smartphone. It's this, basically, with a whole lot of other additions attached to it. So that's journalism today now too, that you have these really consumer devices with a few enhancements that enable you to shoot possibly broadcast quality content that ends up in the nightly news, or perhaps more likely, again, because, again, how many people here still watch the news at night, like the actual news broadcast? Nobody. Okay. So you're reading more newspapers than watching news. That's interesting too. But, you might see something from this in some clip somewhere embedded in a website, or you might see a clip on YouTube or TikTok or wherever else, basically, that this material now ends up. And it's going to be broadcast quality, basically. It's going to be 1080p or something. So that's also the reality of journalism today, that we've got, again, these kind of mobile independent units, these individual journalists. And this guy, again, it's staged, obviously, but people like this guy might be going around doing all the shooting, editing possibly the video even on their smartphone or uploading it to YouTube or somewhere and editing it there. And then possibly also writing the story, or maybe extracting the audio and doing a podcast or some audio piece for radio or whatever. So more and more we've got these kind of all-purpose journalists who are doing the video, the audio, the writing, the editing, the preparation, the photography obviously as well, taking stills out of this and putting that to a story. So the practice of journalism has changed fundamentally, particularly over the last 10 or 20 years, with the advent of these kinds of devices, not just computers themselves, and the adoption of all of these sorts of technologies. So the practice of journalism itself has really fundamentally changed. Woodward and Bernstein, I'm pretty sure, never took a photo in their lives in a professional capacity. Never took a video in their lives. They might have been interviewed a few times on camera, but by other people and by probably a team of other people. So that's the whole kind of infrastructure of journalism. All of what sits around that has shrunk and has become just a thing that the individual journalist now does. So that's a really big change. If you think about what that means in terms of what's being produced in terms of content, and who's able to produce it as well, because yes, this guy has that equipment. I could buy that equipment and call myself a journalist and go out and do stories on whatever I like. Any of you could do that as well. Maybe you are. So it's enabled a much larger group of people to do journalistic or quasi-para-journalistic work as well, than just the people who happen to have jobs at the Washington Post working for Katharine Graham. So that's a big change. And again, I've talked a lot here about technology, which has enabled that, but it's not technology that's driving it. It's the fact that people like this, who, I mean, again, this is a stock photo, but if we took him as a real journalist, he may be someone working for the Washington Post. He might be someone working for InfoWars. He might be working for himself, doing freelance work. Might be working for, his own blog. Any of that is possible, but that's the point. Any of that is possible, and people like him have embraced these sorts of technologies to do journalistic work in the broadest possible sense. So it's actually getting difficult to draw the line between what is a journalist and what isn't a journalist today, of course, as well, because, again, anyone can access that technology and do work that looks like journalism, but you don't have to work for the Washington Post or the New York Times or any other kind of official news outlet anymore to do that kind of thing. So that's a big, big change that's happened. And then there's this. Now, this is an actual journalist, and I'm pretty sure no one here is going to recognize him because of the way he works. Look at the setup to start with. There's this sort of 3-screen setup there. 2 of them are showing what looks like various Twitter feeds next to each other or other social media feeds. There's an ABC News story that you can just make out in the middle there. He's got his keyboard, his mouse. He's obviously doing this so much that he has to have a little glove here to keep himself from getting RSI from all the clicking that he's doing. He's got his headset there as well, and all of that. So that's also the setup of a professional journalist these days. It's a very different setup from that guy who's out in the field doing stuff, shooting whatever it is that he's shooting. But this is also journalism, and this is what's also somewhere in the title of the book and of the course. This is really news curation. This is what this is. So here's someone who's following all of this news coming in via Twitter and other social media, via a news site and via news stories more generally. And he's pulling all of that together into a news feed that he then publishes. In this case, this is Andy Carvin. He was one of the key people during the Arab Spring in 2010 to 2012, depending on how you count, who was pulling in all of the first-hand information from Tahrir Square in Cairo and elsewhere, pulling all of that information together into his own Twitter feed, republishing, retweeting, reposting a lot of the news coming out of Egypt and other countries in the region, and making that intelligible for an international audience, translating to an extent, verifying, the eyewitness reports coming in from demonstrations and so on, pulling all of that together, adding his own journalistic, if you like, imprint or verification or support to this, making it more visible through that process and sharing it with his own followers. And so he became, on Twitter itself, a channel of well-sourced, well-verified, reliable information during that event. And he did it all from an office somewhere in the US at National Public Radio. So he wasn't in the field. He wasn't in Cairo or anywhere near the region. He just happened to have lots of good contacts and the ability to ask them and to verify and to juxtapose different reports coming in, pulling all of that together. That's what he did, and that's what the journalistic work is that he did during this time. And he did it not simply for his employer, NPR, National Public Radio, as a radio kind of show or something, but he did it as a Twitter feed. So that too is the changing face of journalism these days. This is purely kind of a secondary process of watching what's coming through all of these different channels, selecting, curating, and then putting it out again in a new channel that hopefully the audience thinks is authoritative and reliable and informative and all of that. So that's, again, a form of journalism that simply wouldn't have been possible before, and it takes people like him to invent, in a sense, and establish this kind of approach of doing work, maybe kind of a secondary form of journalism, but certainly doing this kind of work, and establishing, essentially, and developing an audience, I guess, for it as well, more than anything. All right, so these are some of the kind of the key themes of transformation, I guess, that we'll see. Again, a lot of this still is very technology-focused, I guess. It is the availability of laptops and smartphones and tablets and whatever. It's the availability of social media platforms, obviously, and of the publishing spaces as well, where you can then, in turn, put this kind of content out into the world again. But I really, again, I want to stress, it's not the technology itself that's doing any of this. It takes people like this to work out, hey, we could use this technology in a particular way and change the way that journalism works, possibly very fundamentally. And if they're not doing it, someone else will, possibly someone who isn't a journalist in the first. And some of this is really driven by all of the various crises that journalism has faced, continues to face as well. And I don't just mean journalism perhaps itself, but really the journalism industry, the media industry, journalism as an industry. So the first and what tends to be seen as the most fundamental challenge that the industry has is traditionally, particularly if you look at newspapers, but also broadcast journalism, it's been funded by advertising. Newspapers themselves, yes, sell for a certain amount of money, but that money itself, the money, those of you who are still buying newspapers, the money that you're paying to buy the newspaper isn't at all covering the production costs. So the way that newspapers make money is they have big ads, big and small ads actually, in the newspaper. So you might have these kind of half-page or full-page ads for, I don't know, supermarkets selling their stuff, but you also have the small classified advertising that's somewhere down the back of the paper, where people are selling cars and whatever else, basically. That traditionally has been a big part of the income for journalism. And obviously in broadcast as well, you've had advertising on TV and radio, and that's been a big income source as well. The problem is just that since the early 2000s or so, I'd say, much of that advertising has moved online because advertisers worked out, A, we can reach a bigger audience by having ads on websites. B, those websites in the first place or early on didn't really know how much to charge. So they didn't charge that much, so advertising was much cheaper online to begin with. And C, particularly when we get to social media, that advertising can be targeted much more to specific audiences. So rather than just having a big ad for a new car in the newspaper, you can have an ad for that car on Facebook and target the specific demographic that is likely to buy that car. So much of the advertising, most of the advertising has moved over from the traditional journalistic platforms to online advertising, and there the money goes in the first place to places like Google and Facebook and others that are driving, that are basically operating the online advertising market. So journalism lost a lot of funding, basically, from the advent of the web onwards. That's also caused some problems within the industry, of course. The less funding you've got, obviously, the fewer workers, the fewer staff you can employ. So employment has become a lot more precarious in the journalism industry. If any of you are looking to move into journalism, I'm sure you will, and good luck to you, but it has become a lot harder than it has been in past decades because there are fewer jobs around, and the jobs, particularly the entry-level jobs that there are often more freelance, more precarious, less stable, basically, than they used to be. And that's really true around the world, and particularly possibly in the Anglo-Saxon market. So that's been a big crisis, and it means that, of course, there are simply fewer staff around to do the work, and that obviously then affects the quality of the product as well, if you want to think of news as a product. Then, of course, well, with all of the other stuff going on, and again, not that many of you are buying newspapers, no one's watching TV news anymore, audience preferences clearly have changed. You're an example of that. I'm an example of that as well, even though I'm a different generation. And that shift is continuing even further, and of course keeps shifting as well as new platforms come along that might be used for journalism. So the way that people are accessing the news, where they're looking for news, what kind of news they're looking for, what they do with news, all of that's changed as well, right? So even just with the advent of search engines, of course, you could search for news. You didn't have to go to a website and look for news there, but you could just search for it and find it there somewhere. So you didn't have to read the entire paper or watch the entire news broadcast anymore to find out what's going on. You could just pick out the stories that you're interested in. And that also means, by the way, less advertising income for news, because you're no longer reading all the stories on a website, but you're just reading one or two that you're actually interested in. And of course, again, this is more on the technological side, just the shift in the technology being used. So all of the new platforms coming along, the web in the first place, blogs and other Web 2 type technologies, social media in a general sense, in their various permutations, streaming media like YouTube, like TikTok and others, podcasts, all of this sort of stuff that's emerged over the past 20 years or so. So that's changed, what platforms people are consuming news on, what channels they're following. Not all of that is mainstream news anymore, mainstream media anymore, but they might be following individual journalists or some fringe outlet or some specialist outlet as well. The formats have changed, and of course, new competitors, new companies, born digital news outlets have come along that do news in a different way, and maybe just for a more niche and more specific audience. And they're now competing with the mainstream media that still exists. And of course, the other big problem that's happened over the last few years is that the very authority of news itself, of news media, has been questioned more and more. For political reasons, we've had, at least since 2016, these attacks against the mainstream media as being fake news or liberal news media or whatever, depending on what country you're in. This takes different wordage. Obviously, in the German-speaking countries, there's this idea of Lügenpresse as well, so the lying press that's been reactivated from Nazi times. So, it's become partly because of this confusion of all these platforms and formats and everything else. It's become easier, in a sense, to critique different parts of the media environment for not representing the people or reporting in the wrong way, or maybe just finding an alternative news source that reports in a very different way, and thereby saying, well, if they're reporting about it this way and they're reporting about it that way, who knows who's right? So, and then we can say, well, this is the right story and the other thing's just fake news. So that's very much undermined or challenged the authority of news media. And of course, whenever then there is some genuine problem with mainstream media reporting, that again adds to the argument of these extremists who say, well, news media are lying all the time. So that's up the ante as well. And, this is kind of just the general point that overall things continue to change quite rapidly still. New technologies, new platforms come along all the time. New ways of doing news come along all the time as well. Some will work, some won't. Some will be there for a while and disappear again. Others might be established for the much longer term. And a lot of this is ultimately unpredictable because it now also very much depends on what audiences want and what audiences do with the news. So some new way of doing news, let's say, doing news podcasts, could have fallen flat on its face if there weren't enough people who are really interested in listening for 15, 20, 30 minutes to someone talking about a particular news aspect. But if people are, say, commuting in public transport to work every morning, then perhaps that's a nice way of spending those 30 minutes that you're sitting on the tram. And so there is maybe an audience for it. And if you look at, for instance, podcasts, you'll see that the audience around the world probably matches quite closely with commuting times, for instance. How much time people actually have to spend listening to podcasts. Or maybe family structures. Do they really have time to sit around at home and listen to a podcast? Or are they living with their extended family and there's always something else going on that takes their attention? So how all of this changes depends on a lot of other contextual factors as well, is what I'm trying to say. So all of this in some ways, yes, is related to the internet or the web or whatever else you want to call it, but it's not just the technologies, it's actually what people are doing with those technologies, how they're adopting them, how they're responding to them, and all of that as well. Okay, so what does journalism today look like? This is kind of a bleak picture, I guess, I've been painting so far, and I tried to find some bleak pictures to go along with that. So that's from 2016, so that's, well, not quite a decade ago, but not far off. The winter really is coming for many of the world's news publishers. You could see that Game of Thrones has started by then. So some pretty, bleak kind of outlook, essentially saying, well, the news is in trouble. News publishers, news companies are in trouble. But at the same time, and a bit earlier, admittedly, Brian McNair said, well, this emerging cultural chaos will be exciting and rich with possibility. New stuff could happen from all of this as well. This could bring change that could be good for journalism, could be good for news, could be good for news consumers as well. But it is a point of chaos at the same time as well. It's cultural chaos because all of these different forms of journalism, legacy as well as new forms of journalism, are still around and are intersecting with each other in again, fairly unpredictable, chaotic ways. And it will take some time to sort out what remains after all of that as well, and whether the quality of news and journalism after that is actually as good or even better than what was there before. However we want to, judge the quality in the first place. So that's kind of the journalism side, I guess, the news industry side. And I've said a little bit already, but I want to go a bit further into the question, well, what about us as all of us news consumers? What are the big changes here? And this is one of the big changes that I've mentioned a little bit before. This is from the Digital News Report from 2017. if you're not familiar with the digital news report, it's a really valuable source to explore. This is the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford that organizes a multi-country study every year via surveys, representative surveys of news consumers in 30-odd countries around the world to understand how people engage with the news, what the current trends in the news are. And this is, again, from 2017, this is their overview of who consumes what. So you see there down the side in the different colors, different age ranges. And yet they're mapping this against who consumes what, what's the main source, so the first and most important source of news for these different age groups. And you see there, 55 plus TV is still the main news source. And it kind of declines pretty steadily. So for more than half of 55 plus year olds, TV is still the main news source. For less than a quarter of 18 to 24 year olds, TV is still the main news source. And from what you've said, for you all who are somewhere probably in that age range, I'm guessing it's probably even less. By now, maybe since 2017, it's declined even further. But so legacy media like TV are kind of disappearing in some way as a news source. And it's not really likely, I think, that these younger people who are now not using TV, as they get older, will suddenly discover news on TV as an important news source for themselves. Maybe as their life circumstances change and they settle down, they have kids, whatever, maybe yes, but it's probably unlikely that this will tick up very significantly. On the other side, you've got younger generations for whom online media in the first place are obviously the biggest news source. 2/3 or so of 18 to 24-year-olds around the world, online media is their first news source. And it declines again, it's only 28% for 55 plus year olds. And then within that, the next section over there is social media. So about 1/3 or so of 18 to 24-year-olds in 2017 got their news in the first place from social media. Fully a third, and only 7% of 55 plus year olds. So that's a big generational gap. And by the way, radio and print hardly matter at all anymore. So it's online or TV, and that's the big shift that's going on here, basically. So as these younger generations get older, it seems unlikely that suddenly their media preferences will change and they'll suddenly discover the joys of TV news, and no longer use online media to access the news. So that's really something that the industry needs to grapple with, but in the first place, it represents our changing behaviors in accessing, in engaging with the news. So online media, and within that particularly also social media, are a really big factor. And this is an example, without being morbid about it, I might just ask, how did any of you find out that Queen Elizabeth had died? Where did you see it first? On Twitter? Yeah. Online newsflash? Yep. Instagram? Yep. Okay. So online. I mean, we could go through all of you and we'll probably get similar answers, maybe different platforms, but online. And that's now the norm. I mean, yes, you might have been watching, I don't know, the football or something on TV, and suddenly there might have been some little scrolly thing coming up saying, oh, by the way, the Queen's died. But for the most part, you might see it as an online newsflash. You might even have, I don't know, those Apple News notifications on your iPhone or something that come up from time to time, or some other way that even the platform itself, your phone or something, might have notified you there's a big news story that's just broken. But if not that, then probably at some point, maybe someone in your social network might have posted, oh, by the way, the Queen's died, and you might have seen it that way, Maybe you're following news outlets on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, wherever, and you might have seen it there too, of course. But quite likely also you might have seen it just from a friend who found out about it in much the same way and then shared it on to their friends and followers. And in fact, so this is obviously just the trending topic here for the Queen dying from about a week ago or so, I guess. And not just that there is a trending topic. You see that there, if you see my mouse pointer there at the top of the trending topic list, obviously. So Twitter kind of curates these things now a little bit as well. But also then it pulls in automatically from, in this case, some US news sources, Sky News here, live videos and other things that are about the death of the Queen as well. So all of this kind of happens very quickly now on Twitter and on other social media. I mean, breaking news traditionally has been very much associated with Twitter because it's just such a fast medium for this kind of stuff. And I'll talk more about that in future lectures as well. But this goes beyond Twitter itself as well. There is quite a bit of stuff like this happening on other platforms, of course, as well. Some platforms are better suited to this than others, but you know, you're probably just as likely to see it on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or somewhere as you see it on Twitter now. So that's a big difference. It's the news discovery process as well that's changed for a lot of us, I think. And, you know, and sorry about the language there, but I might maybe show that video in the break, but the other thing that also happens very quickly, and some of you might have seen this video already, is that we're seeing potentially humorous, but potentially also misleading responses to these things happen very quickly. So this is a video, and again, I might show it in the break, but this is a video essentially of some Irish dancing in front of Buckingham Palace to Another One Bites the Dust. Yeah. And obviously it came from TikTok. It came from Irish TikTok, as it says there, and was then posted on Twitter in response to the Queen dying. Now, for all the world, this looked like this was a kind of an instant response to the Queen dying, and the Irish, who've suffered a lot from the Brits, basically saying, well, okay, finally another one of our oppressors is dead. That was not the case. This video was taken much earlier. Still is a video of someone dying to Another One Bites the Dust in front of Buckingham Palace, but it's not in response to the Queen dying. So it was just posted in that context, maybe as a joke, and, you know, with that line obviously at the same time saying, well, you know, maybe presenting it as a response to the Queen's death. And then, if you've noticed this already, eventually Twitter actually added a little message down the bottom there saying, this media is presented out of context. Because a lot of people responded. I mean, as you're seeing there, 64,000 retweets, 7,400 quote tweets, 446,000 likes. So it got a lot of response immediately after the death of the Queen and after this was posted. And then finally people noted, well, actually this isn't, you know, isn't quite right. And Twitter went to the trouble of saying, well, actually, no, this isn't right. And, you know, find out more, stay informed, be aware that this is out of context. So that's also, of course, now a fact of our lives, that we get fake news, if you like, misinformation, disinformation, if it's deliberate, about almost any kind of big breaking news event that now happens. And that we, as consumers, as news users, that platforms as the carriage services for news, as the channels where news is posted and is distributed, and of course that news organizations themselves that might pick up on this and report about it need to be aware of, need to work through. What are we seeing here? Is this true or not? The more all of this has moved into the open space of Twitter and other platforms, the more it's possible for us to be misinformed, the more it's possible for this sort of stuff to circulate unchecked and unchanged. And that, of course, is a big problem as well for us. So yeah, there's the message. And speaking of platform power, I want to say a little bit here, and I might get back to it at some point as well. I want to say a little bit about the power of platforms actually as well, because this is one of the most egregious, one of the most amazing but also outrageous cases of platform power that we've seen so far. The page here is kind of blank almost for a reason. So the short story of this is, at some point, the previous Australian government, in their wisdom, decided to pass a law to try and get more money out of Google and Facebook, particularly to support struggling journalism. Not a bad idea in principle, and they basically said, well, you're making all of this money from advertising, you need to share something with the news publishers, basically, because a lot of the advertising is arranged around the news stories that people share on your platform, so you're making money off other people's news stories, and so please share some money with them. And Facebook said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not crazy. And basically said, well, if you're trying to make us do this, we're just going to remove all the news from Facebook in Australia. And that's what they did in February 2021. This is what the ABC News is, our big public broadcaster, the Australian equivalent to SRF. That's what their Facebook page looked like on the 18th of February and in the week after. No posts, just no news. There's nothing there. If you were trying to access particular stories that have been posted already, this is what you're seeing. This content isn't available at the moment, sorry. And then they say it's probably because the owners changed it. No, it's actually because Facebook has blocked news. If you're trying to share any links to news, Australian or otherwise, you saw this. No, so you can't do that. Even if you're an ordinary user trying to share some news update, no, so you can't do that because the government. But then also this. The Bureau of Meteorology, which posts updates about the weather, obviously, that was blocked too. Because for some reason, some algorithm or someone inside of Facebook has decided, well, weather's kind of news. So government agencies that talk about the weather and alert people that there might be a flood coming or a storm coming, that's news. Can't have that either. And then, and remember this is at the height of COVID, government health departments. Also, sorry, can't have that, because if you're posting your updates on how many people are sick with or have died from COVID, or if you're posting updates on where to get vaccinated, or if you're posting whatever else that's important, news information, news-like information about how the pandemic's going, sorry, that's news. You can't have that on our platform, which is a bit of a problem, right, during this time particularly. So that's the power of a platform like Facebook. It did that, it could do it, it could get away with it. And in fact, everything else on Facebook continued, of course, quite as normal. And quite a few people might not even have noticed, because news is not the big thing on Facebook. It's a much smaller, much less important aspect than, for instance, it would be on Twitter. So they did it because they could. And in fact, as it's come out from whistleblowers in the meantime, they blocked the Bureau of Meteorology and Queensland Health and other kind of newsy kind of things quite deliberately as a show of power, as a show of strength. To say, well, hey, we can block all of this stuff too, so don't mess with us. So that's the power of platforms in all of this as well. And we'll get back to that in a later week as well. In the end, this was resolved in some dodgy way. And after about 8 days or so, finally, news became available again on Facebook in Australia. But that's what Facebook can do, and what really any of these platforms can do if they want to. And that's really the power of these platforms, these non-journalistic operators over the circulation of news and journalism in Australia in this case, but really around the world. So the question is generally, I guess, even when this sort of stuff doesn't happen, where are we getting news from? What kind of news are we getting? How are we navigating this kind of online and particularly social news environment these days? Are we actively accessing news? Or are we kind of just discovering it serendipitously because someone in our network shared it? So are you actively looking for, well, you probably weren't actively looking for updates on whether the Queen's died or not, maybe, unless you're really a big royalist or something. But most of the time you probably would just see that because someone found the news a little bit before you and posted it and said, hey, wow, the Queen's died. So that's actually one of the big ways that lots of people, particularly those who aren't so interested in the news in the first place, discover what's going on in the world because someone in their network has shared something. But then also where you're getting it from. If it's just someone in your network sharing a news item, that could be coming from anywhere. You may not be following any particular news sources, news providers, news companies, but it might just be they saw it there and someone else saw it there, so that's what's being shared. So you might get a really kind of weird mix of quality news, not so quality news, fringe news, fake news, in your feed on whatever platform you're hanging out. And that's a problem if you're not looking at what sources this is actually coming from. Can I trust it? What is it? Which you all might be doing, but again, you're not normal. Other people who've got less interest and less media literacy might not look so closely at where their news is coming from. And in fact, is it coming via personal recommendations? To what extent do the algorithms of these platforms that channel and shape the news feeds actually have an impact on what we see and who we're seeing it from as well? Have they perhaps got any kind of deals with news providers as well to highlight their content over other people's? And yeah, then the question is, well, is this actually, whatever that means, real news or fake news or something in between? Neither of those terms are particularly good because news is never just real or fake, but reported well or not, or with some level of professionality or not. And of course, yeah, within all of that, do you just see a particular point of view because that seems to be the dominant one, or that's what all of your friends in your social network are pushing out, or do you see some diversity in what is being shared with you? So, and you know, that's almost another way of saying that, but that's more about the content that you're seeing, not so much the ideology behind it. Do you just see stuff on the narrow things that you're most interested in, or do you see a lot of stuff from all over the place that, you know, shows up in your feed if you're just passively browsing your feed? And why this is important ultimately is, well, if we all consume really different sets of news, if we're seeing really different stories from different sources on different topics, then how can we still have any kind of shared basis for our collective, well, if you want to be grand about it, our collective participation in society and in democracy? If in the end we need to go and vote in an election, or, you know, I'm in Switzerland, in a referendum as well, for instance, how do you make up your mind, you know, properly and fully, if what you're seeing is very different from what the person next to you is seeing? Both of you might just have some half knowledge and some half information. You might come to very different conclusions, but neither of those conclusions might be particularly well informed. So to have a functioning democracy, ultimately, that's at least the prevailing thought. We need to have fundamentally a shared basis of information upon which we can make up our minds. We might still get to very different conclusions between us, but at least we all need to know what everyone else is knowing in order to be able to make an informed choice of parties to vote for or whatever else it might be. All right, so in this last bit of today, I want to talk a little bit more about the course itself and give you a bit more background on me as well. But let's start with the course. So as I've said, this is largely based around this book, which I published in 2018. And you've got the full book on OLAT in the course materials as well. So please just work through it as we go along. And really remember, I guess, with this and any other readings that you do as well, remember the context as well. So this is from 2018. And of course, there have been some further developments in the meantime, and that's why there's a few additional readings in these other weeks, 5, 9, and 11, and 12. So the way we're going through the material is really very much in the order in which it's in the book. So obviously today we've already talked about sort of the differences in journalism, the way that journalism has changed and continues to change, and the way that the way we engage with the news also is changing and continues to change. Next week, I'll go back in time a little bit and really look at the first wave of what we then call citizen journalism or citizen media. So the the emergence from the late 90s, early 2000s onwards of challenges to the existing news media. I'll focus particularly on Indomedia, which was an important platform at the time, and then go through some of the further developments there as well. I've cleverly put a TV icon there because next week will be a pre-recorded online session. There will be a handful of those, particularly early on in the semester, simply because I'm only here as a guest professor for a few months. There are a few other events and things that I need to get to as well. So in a few of the weeks, I'll pre-record the lecture and put that online, obviously along with the readings for you. I'm sorry I can't be here every week with you to do this live, but I guess we're all kind of used to a bit of hybrid teaching from the last few years as well. So next week will be online. So you're welcome to come here and watch it from here, but you're also welcome to do it from home or wherever else you want. So that week really is about sort of the earlier kind of stages of change, and then the next couple of weeks really look at the impact, particularly of modern social media platforms on news practices. And I'll focus in week 3 particularly on the impact of breaking news, so that what we saw with the Queen's death, for instance, is an example, but that's just the latest example in quite a long line of the use of social media for covering and responding to breaking news events. The week after that, we'll go away from that sort of breaking context, from the acute context, to look more generally at the broader practices of news engagement and news sharing in social media, and how that's changing the way we engage with the news. So that again will be an online lecture. And then the week after that, this is one of the ones where there's additional readings, which I've cleverly indicated with the book emojis there. We'll look particularly at fake news and other forms of mis, dis, and malinformation. And that's as I say, that's something that really has taken off very much since I wrote the book and published that book. So I'll throw in a few other readings for that week, which are again already on OLAT as well. And we'll talk about particularly also the wave of mis and disinformation in the context of COVID and in the context of the Trump presidency and so on, of course, which are really obvious examples for this sort of thing. And then we shift over from the perspective of how do people engage with the news, particularly in social media, to how do journalists individually and how does the news industry actually respond to all of this as well. So the first of those lectures is about individual journalists and how they've adapted, sometimes very grudgingly, to using social media in their professional practices. And the next one in week 7 is about the way that the media industry, the news industry, has responded to the wave of social media, the use of social media, particularly also through quantifying engagement via metrics with their news. And I think that's the last of the ones that are pre-recorded there. In the week after that, this is still very much about the news industry, and I'll focus particularly, and this might seem like a very small thing, but I'll focus on live blogs here as a model for embedding, essentially, social media practices into conventional news practices. This is sort of where journalism and social media meet, in a sense, because if you think of live blogs, they are somewhere in between. They're almost like a journalistic version of what a social media platform looks like, but very much controlled by journalists. So it's worth actually spending a bit of time with that and thinking through what that means and how essentially the news industry is trying to bend the practices of social media to its uses and whether that works or not. We'll go back a little bit to the question of fake news, but again on the news media, on the media industry side, and talk more there about what's emerged, again, very much since I wrote the book, as a whole industry of fact-checking sites and outfits. And similarly also media literacy. So again, that's that's additional readings from beyond the book and a more recent report, particularly from the Reuters Institute that we're looking at there. And yes, seeing how, again, the news industry itself is trying to push back against fake news by, having these kinds of more organized fact-checking services and other frameworks. And then that's really the end of the news media part of this. And then we'll look a bit further out at how all of this actually affects the public sphere overall. So if all of this is happening, both on the user side and on the media side, well, where does that take us as a society or as societies? How do we now, overall, all of us together, journalists and news consumers, if you like, news audiences, news publics, how do we actually engage with all of that? How does all of this change the way that news flows in public and in the public sphere? And as part of that, and again, that's some additional readings beyond the book itself, I'll talk quite a bit there also about this continuing kind of debate about whether social media put us all in echo chambers, in filter bubbles. To what extent this actually, again, undermines democracy, undermines society, because we no longer have a shared basis of information. And the short is, I'm quite skeptical about these terms. And again, that also kind of leads us into the question, again, of platforms. So a little bit of what I've talked about here already with the Australian news ban. As we go on from the question of echo chambers and filter bubbles, well, there's the broader question of, well, whether it's that or not, but what's the impact of the platforms? What power have they got to shape the way that we engage with the news as users, or that the news industry also publishes its content because they now have the money and they now have the power, and the news industry is just using their platforms. So that's, again, zooming out a little bit from the news industry itself and looking at the other stakeholders in the game as well. And then we'll conclude in week 13, and in week 14 will be the exam. And speaking of the exam, so the 23rd of December, sorry, it's just before Christmas, I know, but that's the way the semester works, I guess. It'll be a 60-minute online exam based on themes from the book and the lectures, obviously. So all of the slides that I'm presenting, I'll make available online. Obviously, the podcast, the recordings will be online as well, and you have all the literature already on OLAT. So it'll be based on all of that, basically, and it'll be an online exam, as I say. All right, so just to finish up a little bit then today, I guess because I'm sort of this weird person coming in from the outside, who has no real prior connection to the University of Zurich. So I thought I might just give you a little bit of a rundown of where I'm coming from and what the sort of work is that I normally do when I'm not here. So that's me, obviously. Oh, I'm not wearing the same shirt. Good. It was a close thing. And that's, my profile on the QUT website, if you're interested. But essentially, I've been doing social media research now since social media really started, since the early 2000s or so, and have always been interested, I guess, in the nexus between news, journalism, and audiences, particularly in the social media context. Most recently, particularly looking at online public debate and polarization within it. This is where I'm normally based. That's Australia, and that's Brisbane. So if you're not sure about the geography there, that's sort of the middle of the East Coast, basically. Further on south, there's Sydney and Melbourne and other cities, of course. And that's what Brisbane looks like, just so you kind of know what that is. That's what it looks like at dawn. That's what it looks like from our buildings. So it's a fairly large, 2.5 million people city in subtropical Queensland, where it's now starting to be spring, and I'm here and going into winter, but that's what I do for you. So that's what that looks like, and this is our center. Our aim we are in some ways quite similar to the IKMZ here. In terms of size, I guess as well, we've got about 50 staff and 50 PhD students. Our aim is, as it says there, to conduct world-leading interdisciplinary research for flourishing digital society. Obviously, we are very much focused on digital media and the integration of digital media with other media forms. That's probably a little bit different from the colleagues here who take a broader media and communication research approach. Perhaps that's not quite so focused on the digital, but obviously you can't get around digital media anymore these days either. So that's kind of the sort of environment that I work in. I guess you're not normally invited to these things, but I've experienced here already the Swiss tradition, as I've understood it, of the apéro. So this is sort of the best example of a kind of an apéro that I could find in our neck of the woods. I think that's from one of our summer schools. So that's what it looks like when we do these things. Probably kind of similar, I guess. And yeah, to give you kind of an idea of the sort of work, I guess, that I've done and I normally do. So you've not seen this book, but you will have seen, or you will see this book as the textbook really for this course. So I've been working essentially in this space of audience engagement with the news and with journalism and with journalists, for that matter, via online and social media since the early 2000s. The first Gatewatching book came out in 2005. This latest one is from 2018. So I've really been kind of following these developments now for the best part of a couple of decades, I guess. And that's still very much one of the kind of key points of focus for me. I've done quite a bit of work specifically on Twitter as well. And again, with a number of colleagues, we edited this book, Twitter and Society, in 2014, which is bringing together all the different uses that people make of Twitter, basically. So all of the different, everything from news engagement to entertainment and personal uses, to really try and understand this particular platform. And others have gone on in the meantime to do work on other social media platforms as well. And I think it's really important to actually capture the full breadth of uses. I mean, now, of course, this is almost 10 years ago. There's a whole bunch of new uses that have emerged since as well. But it is actually quite important to try and understand the breadth of how these platforms are used, and not actually just to focus, by the way, also on news uses, which may or may not be particularly central to a given platform. And yeah, this again will pick up a little bit on in that week on filter bubbles and echo chambers. One of the kind of outcomes from all of this is also to then see, well, what about this idea that social media put us all in different filter bubbles? Is that actually true or not? And really the short answer is no, to be honest, but that wouldn't have made a very interesting book. So there's a bit more in there. But that's the sort of work essentially that I've been working through. And I guess particularly, I mean, one way to kind of talk about this is I've always done a lot of work on understanding the way that people are using online and social media. So this is an early project in that sense. We then applied that specifically also to crisis communication. We had major floods in Brisbane in 2011. And of course, there's been major other natural disasters around that time. The earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand, the tsunami in the Sendai region in Japan. So we were particularly interested also in how people respond to what is ultimately also a breaking news event, of course, of a natural disaster, and how they're using social media both to share the news as well as to organize and coordinate and respond and fundraise and all of the other things that then happen, and how in fact official organizations, emergency services and so on could also respond to these sorts of cases. More broadly, I guess also I'm interested always in the way that information flows at scale across online platforms. So crisis communication is an example of that, but that also broadens out then again to other things. And again, different form of crisis perhaps, but the question of what happens with journalism if the money is kind of drying up and the jobs are becoming precarious and things are moving online has been something that I've been interested in for a long time as well. So really trying to understand, well, what about all of these new outlets, these new forms, these new practices that are emerging in the online space particularly, and are they sustainable? Are they workable? What happens with them in the longer term? And yeah, most people, I guess, in my space will have done some work on fake news at some point. We actually started this before COVID, but obviously it's also become very much focused around COVID because that has generated, as the World Health Organization said, an infodemic to go along with the pandemic. A pandemic of mis and disinformation essentially being spread about the origins of COVID, the treatments of COVID, the impact and the importance of all of this, and all sorts of other stuff. And again, I'll say in that week on fake news, I'll say a bit about particularly also the work that we've done tracing the dissemination of the conspiracy theory that COVID is somehow related to 5G technology, for instance, which was big for a time. And the most recent project now is on partisanship polarization, which kind of extends this in some way as well, because fake news, mis and disinformation, is also a big driver of polarization, of course. It's being used, it's being weaponized quite actively in order to polarize, in order to divide us, societies overall. You can see this obviously, perhaps most clearly in the US and the use of fake news, of mis and disinformation to divide very clearly between not just Republicans and Democrats, but even within the Republican Party between Trump fans and others. So this is clearly one of the big challenges of our time, and we're hoping to do some work on understanding the dynamics of all of this and maybe find ways to counteract that as well. But that's just to give you a bit of background, essentially, not so much to talk myself up or say these are all the wonderful things I've done, but that hopefully gives you an idea of where I'm coming from and what my interests certainly are and what really I'll be kind of picking up on, I guess, as I go through these lectures with you. And then there is another project that I and that we are part of as well on automated decision-making in society. And that's actually also relevant for us here because it deals with the role of automation, of algorithms, of AI to the extent that that's even a thing, but certainly of the algorithms that shape the flow of information on platforms. And that's, particularly important, obviously, also in how we all engage with the news and even what news we see on our platforms to engage with. So that's another aspect of all of this. So that's me. And what remains for me then to say is just what we cover next time. So look, if you haven't done it yet, then please do read the introduction to the book. And then for next time, read chapter 2 from Gatekeeping to Gatewatching, the first wave of citizen media.